This is Dr. Dave Mathewson in his teaching of third semester New Testament Greek. This is session number 17, Exegesis, Part 1.
What I want to do now is kind of end our, in these next handful of lectures, end our discussion of Greek, kind of intermediate Greek, by transitioning into discussing exegesis. Now, the word exegesis, it actually comes from a Greek word, but it simply means to draw the meaning out of, as opposed to reading something into it that's not there. It's studying, just to kind of use straight, simple language, it's studying a text in a way where you try to draw out the meaning most likely intended by the author and understood by the readers. And another way of looking at it is exegesis is applying sound principles of interpretation to the text in order to uncover its meaning. So what I want to do in this lecture and the next is talk a little bit about the process of exegesis, what it entails, what it looks like, and kind of how I understand it, and then begin to look at the individual steps of exegesis as well in this lecture, and then look at the remaining steps in the next one. Then the final lecture, we will actually look at a text together and see how the steps of exegesis work and how they can be applied to interpreting the text. So when it comes to exegesis, basically, the first thing I want to say is that the main goal of exegesis is to mainly to provide a plausible interpretation or reading of the text that most likely reflects what the author intended and what the readers understood. Obviously, without the author here to tell us exactly what he meant 2,000 years later, it's difficult to say that I got exactly what the author is intending to communicate. But the text is a written record of an author's communication, and we can try to and attempt to understand what was the author trying to communicate and get as close as possible, or come up with a plausible interpretation that likely reflects the author's intention given the text that we have. So the goal of exegesis then is to study the text as a record of an author's active communication to his readers by applying methods of interpretation to attempt to come up with a plausible reading that most likely reflects what the author intended. I remember one time the difficulty of appealing to the author's intention sometimes came home to me once when I was talking with a British scholar who had written something that was related to research I was doing, and I asked him about something he'd written, and he said, "Did I mean that?" And he said, "I wonder what I meant by that." And he was dead serious. So even authors sometimes can't remember what they meant or have difficulty recalling what they are trying to communicate. But all we have is the text. And our interpretation is not so much of the presumed mind or thinking of the author behind the text, but all we have is the text itself. And the primary goal is to interpret the text in light of what we know about the author and readers, in attempt to provide a plausible reading, an interpretation of the text that we can justify by the principles of interpretation that we apply to it. So again, the goal is to provide a plausible interpretation of a text that most likely represents and reflects what the author intended to communicate by the text that he has written and formed. The second thing to say about exegesis is there are a couple of ways to look at the process of exegesis. One of them is, and you often hear it described this way, one of them is to understand exegesis as a series of steps. Now, just very, very quickly, the steps depending on who you read and what you read, this may differ a little bit, but kind of as I understand it, there's a couple that I'll leave out just because one of them, known as textual criticism, is such a specialized field that we can't hope to deal with it in this time. Textual criticism is the process that actually lies behind the New Testament text you have. If you have the UBS text or Nestle Aland, those are called critical texts. They're the result of the process of text criticism. So I'll kind of skip that one. The other one that I'm going to skip for now is translation. One of the first steps that you will perform when you're exegeting a text is to translate it. But one of the reasons I'm going to skip it too is because the main goal of analyzing a text is not to produce a translation. And your translation will not reflect all of the grammar and the historical background and the theology of the text and the results of your exegesis. But one of the steps, maybe you could say the first step would be to produce a translation of the text. And let me say, one of the values of producing a translation is I actually, at this point, I like to compare my translation with a number of English translations, not so much to help me correct my translation or, if I can't figure something out to help me with that, although it can be used that way, but I like to see what English translations do with certain Greek constructions. All the grammar we've looked at. If you have a genitive and you're wondering what kind of genitive is this, see what the English translation does. Maybe they don't do much with it. But sometimes where translations differ, that will often reveal an issue in the Greek text that you're going to have to deal with. So working on a translation is more value than just producing a translation as one of the steps. It does two things. Number one, it slows you down. It makes you see what is in the Greek text. And then second, by comparing it with English translations, that will often reveal issues where translations differ. You need to ask, why are they different? Maybe it's just a matter of style. That's not a big deal. But if there's a significant difference in how they translate a word or a grammatical construction, or how they put a sentence together, how they divide it, how they divide the text, those can reveal issues in the Greek text that you might have to deal with. And again, your own translation, an initial translation, will begin to reveal issues in the Greek text that you're going to have to deal with in the exegesis, your detailed exegesis later on. So the first step is translation. Another step is the context. And again, I just want to introduce you to the steps. As we introduce the exegetical process, we'll talk in more detail about these later on. One of them is analyzing the context of the passage. Historical, cultural background. We recognize that the New Testament texts were produced in a specific historical and cultural context. And we need to ask questions broadly, like who was the author? Who are the readers? What do we know about the author? What do we know about the readers? What do we know about the historical circumstances? What do we know about some of the cultural values that the author and readers held and assumed in the first century that are very different from ours, that are necessary for understanding the text? One that you should be familiar with is grammatical analysis. That is, studying the grammar of the text. Much of the previous lectures have been devoted, all of them have been devoted to the grammar of New Testament Greek. And so grammatical analysis, studying the grammar of the text, doing things like even studying the rhetorical structure of the text. Lexical analysis, that's a fancy term for doing word studies. Studying the words. Obviously not every one in the passage, that'd take you forever, but analyzing key words, ones that are theologically significant, ones that are problematic, ones where there's debate over their meaning, ones that seem to be significant, maybe they're repeated, or they're significant for the interpretation of the passage. So lexical analysis. Another one would be theological analysis. Studying the theological concepts in the text. We'll talk more about that, but here I primarily don't have systematic theology in mind, going through and mining the text for anthropology, theology proper, soteriology, hamartia, those terms that you learn in a systematic theology class, but we'll talk more about from a biblical theological perspective. Important theological terms like covenant, kingdom of God, creation, new creation, Messiah, Christ, God's Holy Spirit, redemption, etc. Language that comes out of the New Testament itself. And then finally, I would say also the step of synthesis. That is, it's not enough just to analyze the details of the text and just let it lie there. You need to bring it together into a coherent understanding and statement of the interpretation of the text, and show how all of these actually affect and influence the interpretation and understanding of the text. So, depending on what exegesis textbook you might read or something like that, or a course that you might take, you might find a couple of other steps or different names for some of these, but these are essentially, at least when I do exegesis and when I teach it, these are the steps that I teach the students and they follow in producing their exegesis papers. Now, given those steps, a couple, if you're like me, I'm a visual person. Sometimes it helps me to see visual illustrations of something, whether it's like that participle flow chart that we did on the lecture in participles or whatever. A couple ways to illustrate the process of exegesis. One is to see it as a stair step. The steps of exegesis. You often see that language used in textbooks on exegesis, steps of exegesis. And each of these steps represents one of those steps of exegesis, whether context or grammatical analysis, historical cultural analysis, lexical analysis. And what this helps you see is that these are each, at one level, these are each discrete steps that you need to focus on and be aware of, and that they build on each other as well as you get closer to the meaning of the text and an understanding of the text. What this may not illustrate quite as well is it would be easy to think that these are too discrete. That is, I do my context analysis, and when I'm done, then I go on to the next one. I can kind of leave it aside. And then when I'm done, I go on to the next one. And when I'm done with that, I go on to the next one until I get through them all. And when I get to the top, there it is. I got the meaning of the text. Well, it's a little more complicated than that, but it does help you see that there are discrete steps. Approaching exegesis is not just, let's jump into the text and just start fooling around with it or working with it, and you have no disciplined method. This helps you to see it's a method, and you don't just jump into it without any kind of idea of where you're heading or where to start, what to look for, what kinds of questions to ask of the text. Another helpful illustration that it's not in addition to this, but it complements this, is the illustration of a spiral. And I like to draw my spiral like this. It moves upwards and it gets tighter. And what is happening is this sort of illustration demonstrates that through the steps of exegesis, we are interacting with it. We kind of enter into an interaction with the text. It's not just the text is an object, I do this to it, I do this, I do this, I do this, and there's the meaning of the text. But it's more of a back and forth. It's more of an interaction. I like to see the steps of exegesis as probing the different dimensions of the text. Texts are made up of words, so lexical analysis is necessary. It's made up of grammar, so grammatical analysis. It's produced in a historical, cultural context, so cultural and historical analysis are necessary. The New Testament is theological, religious literature. Theological analysis is necessary. It's a written piece of communication with a context, so literary context. So I like to see the different steps of exegesis as kind of informing this spiral process, this interaction with the text. But notice it's not just an open-ended spiral that goes nowhere. It's getting tighter as I'm arriving at a more informed and more plausible interpretation of the passage through these steps of exegesis. And again, it just shows that at one level, yes, I work through these steps of exegesis, but sometimes I'll do lexical analysis and later on when I'm doing grammatical analysis, I might have to go back and revise or revisit my lexical analysis. Or maybe what I did with grammatical analysis now is going to affect what I do with the theological analysis. You kind of see how it goes. So the spiral is also a helpful, I think, visual illustration of how we enter into a kind of dialogue and interaction with the text in applying these steps, these methods. But again, it's not just a vicious spiral that goes nowhere, but I've tried to demonstrate that it gets tighter as you get, even if you don't come to a definitive once-for-all interpretation of the text, is you've come to an interpretation of the text that is plausible and that is most likely reflecting what the author intended. And you can justify it through demonstrating this coheres with the lexical analysis, with the grammar in the text, with what we know about the historical cultural background, with the context, with the theological teaching of the text. My interpretation fits that and coheres with that. So that's one way to look at, or two ways to look at the process of exegesis. And again, both those illustrations are helpful in demonstrating that it is a series of steps that we need to follow to be disciplined in our exegesis rather than sloppy. But it's also an interactive approach in that we interact with the text. We approach it with these methods, but they continually inform our understanding and we revise it. And they influence each other, each of the methods, and we get closer and closer to an understanding and an interpretation of the text that is validated by these methods, that is a plausible interpretation of the text. So let's go back and look at a little bit more detail of some of these steps of exegesis now that we've sort of looked at the process as a whole. I've already talked a little bit about translation, so I don't want to repeat that. We won't right now treat it as a separate step, but again, that's probably going to be your first step in exegesis. If you're writing an exegesis paper in a seminary context or something like that, the translation will often be the last thing you do too. After your exegesis, you'll go back and revise your initial translation that reflects what you did. But the first thing then I want to look at is context, or in this case, we're talking about the literary context. And this is just simply asking the question, what is your passage doing where it is? Why is your passage where it is? How does the section before prepare for your passage, and how does your passage prepare for the section after it? Or how does your passage grow out of and develop from what comes before? And then how does it prepare for, or how does it relate to what comes after? Asking the why question. Why is this passage here? And the how question. How does it contribute to the author's argument? I like to kind of see it like this. So this is your text, whatever text it is you're dealing with. And you want to understand how it relates to the passage that comes before it, the unit or units that come before it, and then how it relates to what comes after it. What's it doing there? How does it fit the argument? A really interesting example of this is found, just kind of an easy example, is found in 1 Corinthians and chapter 9, especially the earlier verses. In this section, Paul appears, there's probably a few things going on, but one of the things is Paul appears to be arguing for his right as an apostle to receive the financial support of the Corinthians. And I've actually heard people use this text, pastors especially, and maybe not totally in the wrong, but use this text to demonstrate, well, full-time Christian workers should receive the support of the congregation. And that seems to be what Paul's arguing for, is don't I have the right as an apostle to receive the support of those that I've labored among? But if you look at the context of chapter 8 and 10, it's all within the context of Paul telling the Corinthians that they should be willing to surrender their right to eat meat offered to idols if it causes harm to the rest of the body of Christ. So that is sacrificing their right for the greater good of the community. And so chapter 9 of 1 Corinthians, those early verses, are not primarily Paul arguing for his right to receive the Corinthian support. It's kind of the opposite. Although he had the right, he is an example of someone who had the right to financial support, but he gave up that right for the greater good of the Corinthian body. And so that's what he's asking the Corinthians to do. 1 Corinthians 8 and then 1 Corinthians 10, actually the latter part of 9 and then 10. If all you did is read 1 Corinthians 9 and several of the early verses, you'd easily draw that conclusion. Oh, Paul's arguing for his right as an apostle to receive financial support. And in a sense he is. He does demonstrate he does have the right. But the whole point is he gave up that right for the greater good of the gospel and the Corinthian body. And that's what he wants the Corinthians to model themselves on, his own giving up, surrendering his right as an apostle. So literary context is a very, very important step. In fact, so important, I'd say you're not ready to move on to any other steps until you can handle this, until you can answer this question. And the important thing to do too, this is crucial. When you're doing this, and it's helpful to summarize it and write it out. In fact, sometimes I will actually do this. I'll draw boxes and I'll summarize what's going on in each passage, and then I'll try to describe what is the relationship, what's the argument. And that's another way to look at it, is tracing the author's argument. How's the author arguing his point in the section, and how does this contribute to it, your passage? But one thing to make sure you're not doing is, I like to call it just rewording the content. Sometimes I'll even find this in commentaries that are purportedly discussing the context. All they'll do is say, chapter 1 is about this, and then in chapter 2, verses 1 through 4, Paul shows he's an apostle. In chapter 2, 5 through 8, he demonstrates his relationship to the church. And all they're doing is just summarizing the content, and they're not really telling you, well, what's the thread of thought? What's the argument? Asking the why and the how question. Why is this here? How does it contribute to the argument? How does it relate to the flow of thought? So this is a crucial a crucial step, tracing the context. When you have your passage for writing a paper, preaching a sermon, doing a Bible study, place it in its context and do not move on until you're able to just explain what it is doing there. So that's step number one, the literary context. Step number two, and some of these might not necessarily go in this order. Another visual kind of illustration of the process of exegesis is an hourglass. So kind of a footnote here. So if you ever use an hourglass looks like that. And the exegesis begins broadly by asking broad questions of context, historical background, authorship, readers, things like that. And then it narrows down and you get into the nitty-gritty of the text, the wording, the grammar and things like that, the theological themes. And then you broaden back out in synthesis, and you bring it all together into an overall statement of the meaning of the passage. So there is sort of a logic to the steps, but the next one would be the historical and cultural background. And this happens on two levels. One is, I draw this language from an exegesis textbook by two individuals named Hayes and Holliday were their last names, and they wrote a very helpful book on exegesis, and they distinguished between the history of the text and the history in the text. And I find that helpful. The history of the text would be issues like who is the author and who are the readers and what is the issue or situation, what's the crisis that the author is addressing. An easy example, not that it's easy, but a clear example is the book of Colossians. Is what is the most people agree that there is some kind of a false teaching that Paul is addressing, but what is the nature of that false teaching? What do we know about the Colossians? What do we know about this false teaching? Is it primarily Greek? Is it Jewish? Is it a combination of them? What level of threat is it? What are they offering that Paul is refuting? And how does that make a difference in what Paul says and how he writes? So history of the text would be kind of at the top of the hourglass. You're exploring the historical background of the text as far as authorship, readers, if the date is important. What is the crisis? What is the problem that the author, is there a problem? What is the issue that the author is addressing? So that is important to establish and figure out. That will provide the historical cultural context for the rest of the process of exegesis. But then the history in the text. Are there specific historical or cultural references in the text that you have to figure out? For example, in Jesus' parables, when he uses the image or when he uses the illustration of a master and a slave, or workers in a vineyard. What do we know in the first century culturally about how that worked that makes a difference in the reading of the parable? What do we know about stewards and masters relationships that makes a difference in the reading of the parable? What do we know about Samaritans that made the parable, the Good Samaritan, such a shocking story? So looking at specific historical references or cultural references or assumptions in the text. Let me give you an example. This is a favorite one of mine, and this comes from Revelation chapter 3, and this is the last of the 7 messages to the churches, and at the end of chapter 3 of Revelation, and the verses that I want are verses 15 and 16 primarily. this is where we find the language of hot and cold and lukewarm. And Jesus, speaking through John to the church at Laodicea, basically says, I know your deeds. You are neither hot nor cold, but you are lukewarm. Because you are neither cold nor hot, but you're lukewarm, I'm about to spit you out of my mouth. And there's been all kinds of discussion. What does he mean by hot and cold and lukewarm? What is that? And usually, the way this passage has been understood is in terms of spiritual temperature, usually from a North American perspective. And so hot means to be on fire for Christ. And cold means to be turned off. You want nothing to do with him. It's a complete animosity toward, a complete rejection of Jesus Christ. And then lukewarm is somewhere in between. I hear people describing it, lukewarm as wishy-washy Christianity, or a Christian that won't take a stand. You're just kind of riding the fence. Sometimes you go to church on Sunday and you worship and you're excited, but then kind of the rest of the week you're not sure and you really don't take a stand for Christ and you're just kind of wishy-washy on the fence. So you're not on fire for Christ, neither are you turned off and rejecting Christ and want nothing to do with him. You're just kind of right in the middle. I don't know if you've heard that, but that's how this passage is usually understood. Most likely, we need to understand it in a very different way, and that's probably not correct because it more reflects our, especially North American understanding of hot and cold and lukewarm. But here's where we need to understand it in light of the history and culture of the city of Laodicea. And what I would suggest to you is both hot and cold are good things. The hot water would have represented, I stood in Laodicea when I led a group over there a few years ago from Denver Seminary to Greece and Turkey, and I stood in Laodicea, and you can look across the valley and see kind of the cliffs of Hierapolis and all the white stone that came from the hot mineral springs. In fact, people would come from all over to sit in those springs for the healing quality, and people still visit that, and you see people still wading and things like that. But probably, if you're in the city of Laodicea and you hear hot, you're probably thinking of the hot water of Hierapolis right across the valley, and that would have been good for healing. You may have also thought, because later on at the end of this, Jesus is going to use the image of a banquet. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and lets me come in, I will come and dine with him. It's also possible that the hot recalls hot beverages that are good for drinking. Now, what about the cold? Not far from Laodicea was the city of Colossae. And Colossae was well known for its cold water supply and its drinkable cold water. And on top of that, again, in terms of banquet, the banquet imagery, it's also possible that the cold would have recalled chilled wine, for example, or chilled drinks that were fresh. But the whole idea is cold to the Laodiceans would have recalled refreshment, something that was cold and refreshing and drinking. Like, if I was raised in the Midwest and on a hot day of working, it's nice to sit down to a glass of iced tea. I'd like that was cold and refreshing. That's the idea of cold. So what about lukewarm? Lukewarm is the exact opposite. Lukewarm is not wishy-washy, middle of the road. It's not between hot and cold. It is the exact opposite. Lukewarm, in fact, notice the image Jesus uses. You are lukewarm, I am about to vomit you out of my mouth. That's not wishy-washy indifference. That is that lukewarm. One of the things lukewarm water did in the first century was it could be used to induce vomiting, and that may be what the image Jesus is drawing on here. But the idea is lukewarm isn't good for anything, and Jesus is saying, I wish you were hot or cold, like water, like hot drinks at a banquet, or cold refreshing drinks, or the hot water springs at Hierapolis, or the cold refreshing drinkable water at Colossae. Instead, you're like lukewarm water that isn't good for anything. It's so gross that it's only good for inducing vomiting. And that's what Jesus compares the readers of Laodicea to. And notice, if you read the letter to the Laodiceans, they are not wishy-washy and riding the fence. They're the worst of the seven churches. They are so bad that they're in danger of losing their lamp totally. And so, in the context of the first century culture and history, cold, hot, and lukewarm means something very different than we sometimes take it to mean. Maybe a better illustration would be, instead of spiritual temperature, would be, you go into a restaurant. If you go into a restaurant that still has waiters and waitresses, why do they come up and keep filling up your water cup glass, even before it's empty? Or why do they keep filling up your hot coffee cup? Because nobody likes lukewarm coffee or lukewarm water. You like your water cold. And you like your coffee hot or cold if it's iced coffee. Those are good. Hot and cold are good, but lukewarm, nobody likes that. So understanding the historical and cultural background can make a key difference in how you interpret New Testament text. Now, in the next lecture, we'll consider the remaining steps of exegesis, and then, as I said in the final lecture, look at a passage in the New Testament and apply the steps and kind of see how they work.
This is Dr. Dave Mathewson in his teaching of third semester New Testament Greek. This is session number 17, Exegesis, Part 1.